Hello everybody and welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, and this week we're doing our State of the Format Address episode for Lost Caverns of Ixalan. If you're new to the channel, new to the podcast feed, have not joined us for one of these before, they're pretty simple. It's the episode that I do at the beginning of every set that really just lets you know everything I know about this set. I'm going to be info dumping as much as I can, basically just to get you ready for your next draft. Get you winning more, especially for those folks that might be struggling a bit in the format. Gonna kind of recount my interactions, my experience with the format, my view of the format, kind of trying to impose that upon you. Pointing out some cards that you might not have on your radar, pointing out some archetypes that you might not have on your radar at this point, and just generally giving you a big picture view of the format. So buckle in, it's going to be quite the info-dense show. Also, I have to give my PSA like I usually do for these episodes where, yes, there is an arena open this weekend. It'll be tomorrow if you're listening to this episode the day it comes out, November 25th. Sealed on day 1, draft on day 2, like they usually are. Wizards does not do very good advertising for these events, and there's a lot of people that usually just don't even know that they're happening. So if you are one to partake in these arena opens, there is indeed one this weekend, and if you want to play in it, I hope you're able to. And right before we jump into all the action, I do have to call it the Patreon, patreon.com/Limited Level Ups. Keeps the show running. Really appreciate everybody who supports the show every week. If you'd like to support the show or you'd like access to a lot of the benefits over there, go check out patreon.com/Limited Level Ups. There's a bunch of benefits at a bunch of different tiers over there. They're all focused on getting you better at limited magic in some way, whether that be Discord deck tech help or coaching at some of the higher levels. At any level you join, you'll get access to some amount of help to get you better at limited magic. So if that's what you're interested in, if you're interested in either supporting the show or leveling up your game a little bit, go check that out, patreon.com/Limited Level Ups. And without further ado, let's get into talking about some cards. So I like to start off these State of the Format episodes with a bit of a vibe check, just kind of the community reaction, my own feeling about the set, just whether it's a fun set or what people maybe have some complaints, some grievances. And overall, the initial review I've heard so far is across the board pretty lukewarm. I haven't heard anybody really extremely dislike this set. I also haven't really heard anybody loving this set. A lot of the people I've talked to, a lot of the takes I've seen online are kind of like, yeah, it's just like a fine limited magic set. Nothing too special. Some people do have some complaints here and there. I've had a decent amount of fun, although I'll get to some slight criticisms I have in a second. I think that if you are just looking to jump in for your first, 10, 15 drafts, if you've maybe even been waiting for this episode to jump in, I think you're going to have a pretty good time. I do think it's a solid limited magic set. I think that for those people that like to draft the set 60, 70, 80, 90 times, I do think there's going to be some slight issues with replayability, but I do think those first 20 drafts are going to be fun, and they have been really fun for me. Just speaking to overall funness in a very unscientific sense, I think a lot of the mechanics are pretty fun. I think crafting is really fun. I think discovering is sweet. I very much enjoy just like discovering 3, casting Natali's favor on turn 3 and be like, all right, what am I going to hit? Am I going to high roll? I'm going to low roll. You still get that, even my opponent goes for a discover. I'm like, all right, if they miss, it's great. If they hit, I'm going to have a bit of an uphill battle. Like, I think it's a fun moment of tension. So I think that the mechanics in this set do lend themselves to a lot of fun in general. However, like I mentioned, I think there are some valid criticisms of the set. It is a very fast set. Curve start on 1. You can definitely get run over pretty consistently, and that might not be a bad thing for a lot of people. I personally like faster sets, the more aggro sets. If you're somebody who dislikes your opponent playing a 1-mana 1/1 flyer that'll peck you in for like 5 points before you can deal with it, if that's not a feeling you like in your game of Magic, if you don't like racing situations, if you don't like tight combat situations, you might not enjoy this set as much as something that's going over the top, like a March of the Machine or a Dominaria United, right? If you're somebody who really enjoys casting their gigantic spells, this format still has that, certainly, but it's not like the default for all your games. Like 70% of the games are, I would say, about people sticking their early creatures and kind of volleying for that aggro beatdown position. That is how a lot of the games do play out in this format. So if that's something that doesn't really appeal to you, then maybe that's a slight knock for this format for you. Another criticism I've heard is that there's just too many bombs, too many of the rares are too strong. And just like where, you can have people that like aggro sets more, you can have people that like the slower sets more, kind of put yourself on a spectrum. I definitely think there's a spectrum of tolerance for bombs, high rarity cards. There's some people that really like the fact that most packs they open are going to have a very appealing card in the rare slot. And then there's some people who, if they had their way, there just wouldn't be rares in limited at all. Different people are going to find themselves at different points of the spectrum. For me personally, I actually do think that this set is a little bit too bomb heavy, a few too many cards that dominate the game when they come down. And I'm somebody who's pretty far on the end of that spectrum. If I like rares in my limited sets, I think that rares add a lot to just the texture of the format and also just the excitement of, opening your packs. I think it's cool that you get to open your packs and take a cool card most of the time. But I have felt that there's been a lot of pretty good games where I've been like, okay, where we have some good back and forth here. Maybe one player's a little bit ahead, the other player's a little bit ahead, and they play a high rarity card, and it's like, all right, well, no, now they're just majorly ahead. And that's going to happen, right? That's just a feature of limited Magic. That's not something that you should be surprised at. But again, I do think different people have different tolerances for that. I know there's some people that are just completely unaffected by, the difference between a good common and a good rare that their opponent plays. They're just like, yeah, they're both good cards, and I just have to figure that out as I go, right? I have to that's the puzzle I'm working with here. So that might be a knock against the format. Once again, there are a lot of high rarity cards, but you might like that as well. Personally, my number one criticism of this set isn't the speed or the number of bombs, but kind of how the drafts play out. I do really like draft formats that have a lot of flexibility in where your different paths can take you as you go down the draft, where you can pivot pretty easily and there's a lot of cross archetype synergies. And I do feel like that for this set, that's not all that true. I think it's pretty difficult to pivot from certain archetypes to other archetypes. Like in an ideal world, in my ideal draft format, you could start any color combination, and then, you start red-blue and red-green is open. Okay, you can pivot into that pretty easily. And that's not always going to be the case. It's very difficult because, as far as designing a format, you want to be putting synergy in your format. You want to put cards in your format that only play well in one deck, so that the person that gets those cards, they feel very, they feel very smart about that. It's like, yes, I got rewarded. And so you don't want to have all the cards just be like, yeah, it's just a free-for-all, all the great best cards in the world. But at the same time, there is a middle ground, and I think this set falls just a little bit short of that middle ground I'm looking for. Because when you're drafting this format, let's just take the Jeskai color pair. So the Jeskai color pair is blue, red, and white. They all are focused on artifacts. They really want you to draft artifacts. And specifically, a lot of those artifacts are craft artifacts that want you to exile stuff from your graveyard. Well, there's the other trio of colors, the Sultai colors, the Descend colors. And you can kind of think about the format like that, right? There's you can divide the themes into two giant camps, the Jeskai artifact stuff and the Sultai Descend stuff. Well, if you start down Jeskai artifacts, it's very difficult to pivot into any of the Sultai stuff because the cards, number one, don't really care about each other. Like, you care about artifacts in one and you care about the graveyard in another and self-mill and stuff. But the really awkward thing is that if you're crafting, you're actually fighting against descending directly, right? Because you don't want to be crafting with stuff on your battlefield. You want to be putting stuff in your graveyard, crafting from your graveyard. And because of that, that lowers your descend count, right? So I've just had a lot of drafts in this format where I've started one place, realized that those colors weren't open at all, tried to pivot, but then all the cards that I've taken in the early packs just don't play all that well with the cards that happen to be open at the table. That's my biggest complaint with the format. I don't think this is like a critical flaw or anything. It's just something I wish that was a little bit better. I also think that there's a little bit too much junk at common, or maybe not junk directly, but a few too many secret gold cards. A few too many cards that, I was talking about synergy and how you want to plant cards that make people feel good for being in the right lane. Well, I think there's a few too many commons that only go in one deck or only go in like two of the color pairs. And that just results in drafts where you get to pick 7 and it's like, well, there's really not a card I want. Or another situation I've actually concluded quite a bit is I'm drafting and my color is pretty open, or my color pair is fairly open, but there's not really, I'm more playing an activity than a game because there's only really one card in the pack that I want to take, right? Where it's not like, well, here's 3 red cards I could take. It's just like, well, that's the one red card that goes in my deck, so I need to take that card. I've encountered that a little bit. And by the way, this is a minor criticism. I still do like the set. I'm still enjoying it. I enjoy most Magic sets, but I'm just enjoying the draft portion a little bit less than I normally do. So I would give the draft portion of this format maybe like a 6 or a 5 out of 10. And I think the gameplay is totally fine. It's a 7 out of 10. It's nothing exceptional. Sometimes there are some really good games. I've streamed a lot of games where at the end I'm like, wow, that was a really good game. And even the person who I was playing against came in the chat and was like, oh, hey, that was a really great game. There's a lot of room for really good games in this format. But I do think that the draft leaves a little bit to be desired. All right, next up, let's look at the format at a glance. So I'm just going to be talking about all of the archetypes here just very briefly. I do have an archetype section in a little bit that we're going to get into a little bit deeper, but this is just a general, power level ranking of all the archetypes and where I'm seeing them fit into the format. So if you listened to last week's episode, the set overview, not a lot really has changed. I do think that the Jeskai decks are still on top. I think that red, blue, and blue-white are pretty clearly the best decks in the format, with red-white being a pretty good deck too, although not being one of the blue decks is a big deal. I do think blue is the best color, and that gives the nod for me for the blue-red decks and the blue-white decks being the best decks in the format, but I like red-white a lot too. It just so happens that these themes work, the crafting works, the pirates work, the tapping my artifacts for effects, all these work, right? And it also helps that a lot of these colors, like the cards in these colors, are just strong cards. I think that for some of the black and green archetypes, there are just fewer good cards. So with these Jeskai decks, red-blue, blue-white, and white-red, you can be pretty confident just going into these. If these colors are open, you'll have a pretty good time just picking up the good cards in the colors, and there are quite a few of them. I think that at a given table, half or more of the table could be in these colors, and it would, everybody would end up with a pretty decent deck. So I don't think this is the only thing to do in the format, of course, but right now, on week 2 of the format, this is still my default. Yes, these are the best decks. That's not really going to change too much going forward, I don't think. It's just going to be that these decks are a little bit more contested. You're going to have a harder time getting into them, and you might have to reach into something else to draft a solid deck. Next up, and this is a little bit of a change from where I was seeing the format last week, is that I like the green aggro decks quite a bit. So this is red-green dinos and white-green, whatever white-green's theme is. They have the augment my creatures theme, but it's a very, very light theme. It only appears on 3 cards or something. I've been impressed with these decks. I think this is the #1 place you want to go when the Jeskai artifact stuff isn't that open. We're going to get into the specifics after, but just wanted to frame things as, yeah, I actually quite like these decks, and I don't like them that much less than those Jeskai decks that I mentioned. I think that if you can get into the Jeskai decks, great, but this is not a bad place to be at all. I like these green aggro decks. And then we get into tier 3 of the format, which is basically all of the black decks. Black just has a lot of small problems. Number one, unlike the Jeskai colors, I think that its commons are pretty weak, and just, shading it here, I do think that black is firmly the worst color. I had green as the worst color last week, and like you might have guessed, me liking the green aggro decks, I have moved green up a little bit in my rankings. But the black cards, I have not moved up all that much. This isn't to say that you should never draft black. It's not one of those formats where the worst color is absolutely just atrocious and you should never touch it. And in fact, I know there are quite a few people that have had a lot of success with black. For example, I know Sam Black has had a lot of success with just really, really going deep on the Descend, heavy self-mill decks, recurring your graveyard, that kind of, the classic Sam Black stuff. So there's a template there that is successful, obviously. And I don't think you need to be Sam Black for that template to be successful to the point where you're winning. I think Sam Black probably knows the ins and outs better than most people do, but I think you can draft black decks in this format and come out with a good deck. The thing is, though, I do think you need higher rarity cards. I think you need rares. I think you need the good uncommons. I currently have a soft don't draft black unless you have rares rule for myself, and that's worked out pretty well, which is basically just to say I think you want to bias towards the Jeskai stuff. If you can't get into the Jeskai stuff, try to be green. And then if neither of those things are open, then black is probably open. If people at the table are fighting over the good Jeskai cards and know how to draft the good green aggro decks, then that probably means that black is going to be one of the more open colors. You're going to get past rares. You're going to get past good uncommons. It's not a terrible place to be. It's just that you don't want to go into it actively without knowing that it's open or without the good cards being shoved in your face, right? Don't try to just go in for, some random black commons that happen to be open and go, okay, black's open, because sometimes you're just not going to get paid out. You're just not going to get past good rares. You're not going to get past good uncommons, and your deck's just going to be full with a bunch of bad black cards. I also want to call out black-white here as kind of a failure of a deck. I don't think the black-white sacrifice stuff works very well. I think that there's not a lot of great sack outlets and not a ton of great sack fodder, although a little bit more good sack fodder than sack outlets. The uncommon here, Bartolome, which is the black-white 2/1 that you can sacrifice an artifact or creature to put a +1/+1 counter on Bartolome. Perfectly serviceable card. But you look at this card and you're like, oh yeah, this is like the cornerstone for what a good sacrifice deck might be. It just turns out that there's no material advantage you're really gaining from sacrificing things. Like, sure, you're sacrificing things for small little nickel and dime benefits. You sacrifice like a Mephetic Draft to draw a card and lose a life, but then like you're accruing all this small ball value over the course of several turns, and the decks that are trying to go under you, like the Jeskai aggro decks, they just don't really care that much. And the decks that are maybe descending, going really deep, going way over the top, they also don't care that much either, because your value that you're generating is a little bit too small ball. We'll get into how I think Black-White is a draftable deck, and you just want to avoid the sacrifice theme when we talk about the archetypes. Just wanted to point that out. And funny, closing out here, I noticed I didn't even mention blue-green here. It's not even on my slides. That was just an oversight, but that's also kind of emblematic of how I feel about blue-green. I just don't really think it's much of a deck. I mean, if you have a blue-green deck, it's probably just all good cards. Like, blue and green happen to be very, very open. But even the problem there is I don't think the blue cards and the green cards play all that well together. So, yeah, the Explore theme, not, this is what I said last week too, but there's just not enough payoffs going around to make the Explore theme really a deck. So that's my view of the format at a glance, and I think this episode, as I'm recording right now, is kind of a critical time in the format's life cycle, because as I'm recording today, Quick Draft is coming out. So Quick Draft is now available on Arena, and I'm mostly, as I'm saying the life of the format, I'm mostly talking about how people are playing it on Arena, and in every format, the Quick Draft mark, the 2-week mark, always marks a shift in the format where the way things were isn't really how they are going to be going forward. Like, this is the big format development that often happens. Because what happens is, the first 2 weeks, you got everybody in the queues. You got people that only draft once or twice per set. You've got people that are new to the game. You got people that are just drafting to fill out their collection. And so, what happens is, especially if you're somebody playing at Mythic or Diamond or one of these higher ranks, you tend to face these really busted decks quite often, because all these players that might not be as in tune with the draft format or aren't drafting strictly to win, maybe they just want to, draft some cool cards and play with them, they tend to pass on some of the better cards that they don't know are good, and all those good cards just go to the players that know what's up. So you have all these players in higher ranks playing with these sick, streamlined blue-red pirate decks and these blue-white craft decks. There's just all the goodies, because the table just hooked them up. Because I would say at a given draft table in the first 2 weeks of the format, there's maybe 3 people who are really in the know and really, really know what they're doing. And if you're watching this draft video, by the way, like, you're one of these people. I'm not talking about, like, a high-level drafter compared to an intermediate drafter. If you're interested in getting better, you're a person that I consider, like, not part of this crowd where it's just like, oh, I don't know what I'm taking at all. I really want to highlight that the Magic community is gigantic. There's such a wide pool of players that are drafting in the first 2 weeks of the format. And when Quick Draft comes on, which is right now, the format changes a little bit, because generally newer players are drawn to Quick Draft, and so you have them migrating over, leaving best of 1 and best of 3, just the premier queues, as a bunch of people that kind of are more in the know. And I say this to paint a picture of the format, because right now, 8 times out of 10, I've just gotten a good Jeskai deck every time I've drafted, right? And that's just been, a little bit repetitive, I think, and I think a lot of players who draft a lot have felt the same thing. I do think things are going to shift, though. I do think that, as much as I'm saying, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 for these archetypes, you're going to have to draft black decks a little more often. You're going to want to know the ins and outs of how to draft green aggro, because if you're somebody who's just like, yeah, I figured this format out, I'm drafting these Jeskai artifact decks, those are the best cards, you're in for a bit of a rude awakening, I think, this week, because there's going to be a lot of other people that are similarly minded. You're not going to get those, 7th pick Waterwind Scouts or Ultec Cloud Guards anymore. Oh, by the way, I should also say, because I see a lot of people not knowing this, you do draft with the entire player pool. The drafts are not segmented based on ranks, and that's why that dynamic happens, like I mentioned. You've got maybe 3 people that are in the know at a table, and then you have 5 that kind of aren't, and some of them go play in Bronze, and some of them go play in Mythic, and the people that have awesome decks at the table are going to go play in Mythic, and you're going to see those same kind of decks over and over. So if you've experienced that dynamic, that's kind of why, because there's no segmenting of the player base when you go into a draft. All right, let's move into our next section that I'm calling Quick Hits. Usually this is the time in the episode that I talk about the big picture ideas. Usually there's like 2 or 3 really big picture ideas that define how I'm seeing the format. But this time around, it's a little bit more. There's like 5 or 6 little things that I think are important to take note of. And the first one here is something that you might have heard of if you've listened to other content creators stuff or, played the format yourself. But 1-drops are a really big part of this format. Stuff like Goblin Tome Raider, stuff like Miner's Guidewing, stuff like Cogwork Wrestler, all these common 1-drops that are quite strong, mostly for the aggressive decks, but even in your slower decks, you're very happy to play Cogwork Wrestler, which is, by the way, the single blue mana 1/2 flash that comes in and gives something -2, -0. It's a really good aggressive or defensive speed card. Aggressive because if you get into a combat, you can win the combat with the Wrestler, and it's good defensively because, of course, you can come in and ambush something. Curves start on 1 in this format, and you feel behind if you don't start on 1, especially if you're on the draw. Your opponent goes, I play a 1, you say, okay, I don't do anything on my turn. They play a 2-drop, and you hope you have a 2-drop at that point, because if you don't, then you're in for a bit of trouble. This is a format, just like many other fast formats previously, that if you pass that initial gate, the first 3 or 4 turns of the game, where it's just like, okay, my opponents are really pressuring me, if you make it past that, the games can go quite a long time, but you do have to survive the first 3 turns, right? That's kind of the barrier to entry to playing these games. Most of the 1-drops in this set are good, and most of the common ones and most of the uncommon ones. I guess an exception that comes to mind is the green 1-drop at common. It's like a 1/1 mana 1/1 that you can pay 3 to explore. That card's much worse than any of these other cards I'm talking about. But for the most part, I don't think it's a mistake to just load your deck up with a bunch of cheap stuff. This is definitely a winning formula in this format because the ones are so strong. And yeah, not just for your aggressive decks, but your defensive decks definitely want that too. Your aggressive decks a little bit more because they absolutely need to start early if they're gonna get their beat down on. But even your control decks, you gotta keep pace. You gotta get to that 4th turn if you want to play a longer game where you're getting to 7 mana to like flip your 7 mana craft card. So this might be a little bit low-hanging fruit at this point, but if you're newer to the format, this is definitely a sticking point. Second quick hit here, and this is something I talked about in the intro, is this is a pretty bomb-heavy format. I would say it's a little bit different than something like Crimson Vow, if you think about the last truly bomb-heavy format, where in Crimson Vow, the dynamic, I feel, in most games was like, okay, the bombs are really expensive. They're 5, 6, 7 mana bombs. And you always had like this sense of impending doom. You're like, your opponent's going to slam an Averbuck Caretaker or a Dreadfeast Demon or a Toxrill or something. The bombs in this set are a little bit more of the 3 mana variety. Stuff like Kitesail Arsonist, which is the 2 and a blue 2/3 with flying ward 1 that it comes in and makes one of your opponent's things a treasure. Stuff like there's the 3 mana 6/6 Dino. There's Breaches, which is like the red first striking pirate that has a lot of abilities. Stuff like Warden of the Inner Sky, single white mana for a 1/2. You can tap 3 artifacts or creatures to put a +1/+1 counter on the Warden and scry 1. And then if it has 3 counters, that thing gets flying. So all these cards that really dominate the game when they come down, and if you don't have an answer to them, it can be pretty tough. And I actually think these bombs are even a bit more powerful than the over-the-top giant flying kind of bombs that you kind of think of when you think of a typical limited bomb, right? These things that come down on turn 3, demand an answer right away, give you this giant swing of the game, and if there isn't an answer, well, it's probably just going to go in your favor. I'm not trying to say the cards like Bonehard Dracosaur and the black flyer that has lifelink and dies into a land. Those cards are great too. But in the grand scheme of limited Magic bombs, I do think that these 3 mana bombs tend to be a bit more punishing because you don't have the time to go under them, right? One of the ways to beat bombs in a bomb-heavy format is just go under them. And you would think in a format with a bunch of good ones, an aggressive format, that the higher rarity cards might not matter as much. But when they come down on turn 3, they definitely do. So what's the fix for this? How do you approach this from a strategic perspective? You know, this isn't just me going, just a bunch of bombs. That's what the format is. How do you want to approach the format to combat these or to use them, right? To take advantage of them yourself? Well, for starters, as much as I was saying that it's hard to go under these bombs, you're still going to be way more advantaged when you start with a 1 into a 2 than when you don't, right? If you're not doing anything and your opponent plays one of these sicko cards on turn 3, you're very much going to lose the game pretty easily. But if you've gone play a 1-drop, play a 2-drop, your opponent plays one of these 3 mana bombs, even if you don't have that removal spell in the moment, the game's not just over, you can definitely overcome it. It's not just like, okay, well, they played that, I didn't have an answer, I just lose. It's going to be a bit of an uphill battle, but you're going to be in a much better spot if you didn't cast 1 and 2 mana worth of spells before they cast these 3 mana spells. So this is just, once again, encouraging you to start early, lower your curve, make sure you're taking the cheap cards. Past that, though, I think it's a real skill to figure out if you're supposed to use a removal spell on just any creature to get a blocker out of the way or to stop an attacker, or if you're in a position where you kind of have the luxury to hold your removal spells for something better. I've definitely seen very clear mistakes where people have cast their Petrify or whatever removal spell on an early creature that wasn't even stopping them from attacking or wasn't really even stopping them or, wasn't attacking them back. I've looked at game logs in this format where I've seen people go 1-drop into 2-drop into 3-drop and their opponent plays not that much of an impressive creature. Maybe you even have like a combat trick in hand that you could use to win the combat, and the person petrifies the creature. And it's like, well, yeah, you probably didn't have to do that there because you were already attacking pretty well. You still had a pretty good attack, and you save that removal spell for having some insurance against one of these awesome cheap bombs, or one of the expensive bombs too. And you can definitely fall into the trap the other way, where you're like, okay, I gotta hold this removal because there's so many good bombs, and by doing that, you're giving your opponent time to draw into their better cards, time to counteract whatever you're doing, right? So it's this skill that's, I think, quite hard to develop just through me, telling you when you should do things or when you shouldn't. It's much more of an intuition thing that I think you have to develop as you're playing the games. But ask yourself that question. Am I in a position where I'm just fine making this attack still? Or will a removal spell either proactively to get a blocker out of the way and deal my opponent 7 points, or, I'm taking too much damage from this attacker, I have to kill it? Is that what's going to push you forward in the game? Because not every game's going to have the bomb. Not every game's going to be about a bomb. Some of them will be, though, and that's part of your range. So it's that in-the-moment calculation. Really, really difficult, I think, to get right, but try to do it. Start asking yourself that question. Do I have to use this early removal spell? Should I? Does it gain me a material advantage? Or am I fine just attacking, blocking like normal? This is also a format where combat tricks are pretty good. So you still want to hold your removal even in those games that aren't about bombs for combat tricks when your opponent goes for a trick when they attack, or when they invest a bunch of mana equipping an equipment, and you go, all right, you've equipped, I get to kill your thing, and that's a big mana advantage for you. So this is kind of turning into a little bit more of a conversation of when and how to value the removal spells, but that's definitely tied to the bombs. So all just to say basically that bombs are part of this format. They really are. I think they're gonna, just to give a rough number, they're probably gonna pop up in a 50% of your games. You still have some agency over it, though. And figuring out and developing that skill of when to use those removal spells, I think is a really valuable thing to start thinking about and start noting when, oh, I cast my removal spell, my opponent casts a bomb. Well, did I have to do that? Well, maybe I didn't. Or note that, hey, yeah, I just gave my opponent too much time and they started landing their expensive thing. That's really what you have to track to figure out if you're being too hasty with casting your removal spells, or if you're not casting them enough, trying to anticipate, okay, maybe there's a bomb, maybe there's a bomb. Sometimes there's just no bomb, and, you're kind of just setting yourself back for no reason. Next quick hit is on splashing, and my big thought on splashing in this format is it's just not a very splash-friendly format. Number one, it is quite fast, and in faster formats, splashing tends to be a bit worse. Both because the slower decks have a little bit less time to set up their mana, and because if most of the decks in the format are faster decks, well, the faster decks don't want to splash anyways. And that's coupled with the fact that the fixing in the format's not particularly strong. There's a few good fixers, Poison Dart Frog being one of them. That's the 1 in a green 1/1 that taps out a mana of any color. Some stuff here and there, but the lands are not very good for fixing. Like, we've got Captivating Cave. This is the taps are colorless, and you can pay 1 and filter a mana to add a mana of any color. This card sort of looks like Crystal Grotto from Wilds of Eldraine or Dominaria United, but not scrying makes the card completely different. Like, I don't want to play this card as a means of fixing unless I really, have to or want to splash a really good card. But that's the other thing. I just haven't found myself in a position where I want to splash all that often. There's also stuff like Buried Treasure, which I've seen people play. 2 mana to tap, sack it to add a mana of any color. So you're paying 2 mana for a treasure, basically. And you can exile it from your grave to discover 5. Pay 5 to discover 5. This card's just not particularly good at all. I've seen this card in the battlefield way more often than I think it should be on the battlefield. It's a card that, if you have a fantastic card, like I'm talking one of the best cards in the set, maybe I would consider it if you didn't have anything better. But I've seen some pretty suspect splashes off of Buried Treasure. Now, I do think that there is room for a 5-color deck. I've seen some good 5-color decks where you have Poison Dart Frog and the Treasure Makers in red, and maybe a few of the better artifacts that make treasure, like the Mine Cart or the 3/3 vehicle. I think that if your entire deck is focused around splashing and just casting all the good cards you can, that's doable. I would really make a distinction, though, that unlike Wilds of Eldraine, like we just had, you can't just incidentally splash very easily in this set. Where in Wilds of Eldraine, it's like, hey, look, I picked up a good card, I'll pick up some fixing as we go. There's just not that much good fixing, and you need to commit actual high picks to the good fixing. That's I think what it boils down to, is that if you want to splash, it's not just, oh, hey, I got this like 7th pick land that can help me. You actually have to spend picks on Dart Frog early. You have to spend reasonably high picks on like the Mine Cart, or a lot of the red Treasure Makers are high picks. So if you are of the mind of, yeah, I want to splash, or I'm in a draft where I feel like I should splash, you have to pick the fixtures very highly. And if you're not in that kind of draft, you're like, I'm a 5-color deck or a splish splashy deck, I wouldn't even bother. And this is definitely like a heuristic. I'm not saying you should never do it, but just lean towards not splashing in this format unless you're a deck that's dedicated to doing so. My next quick hit is flying is really good in this set. And you might be thinking, well, flying is good in every limited set. That's something that people often tend to say, but I actually think it's a little bit less true than people give it credit for. I think there are some formats where the ground creatures really rule the day, but I don't think this is one of them. Number one, the flying creatures in this set are just really strong. Some of the best commons and uncommons just happen to have flying, so it's not necessarily the quality of being a flying creature that propels them, although it does help. But stuff like Alt-Tech Cloud Guard, which is the white flyer, 3/2 flyer for 4 mana, comes in and makes a 1/1 colorless artifact gnome token. And Waterwind Scout, this is the 2 and a blue, 2/2 common flyer, enters the battlefield, makes a map token. These are the top commons in the format, partially because they give you a lot for the mana that you're spending, but also partially because they do have flying. Same with some of the better uncommons too. Spyglass Siren, single blue mana for a 1/1 flyer, make a map token. Rune Lurker Bat, single white mana for a 1/1 flying lifelink at your end step if you've descended. Scry 1. And the reason I say flying is so effective in this format is because the boards tend to get stalled, not in the sense that the boards are gigantic, where it's like, oh my gosh, like there's 17 creatures on both sides. It's more like there's like 4 creatures on both sides, but they're all like 3/2s and 2/2s. And so if one person goes, okay, I'm going to attack all, the other person goes, all right, I guess I block, or they don't block and they race them back if they feel like that's the thing to do. But there's not many board states in this format where somebody is on the ground just way bigger than your opponent. That's actually part of why the green aggro decks are pretty good, is that you do have that dynamic of the big green dinos can get through the board stalls of, you know, the 2/2s that are just kind of, they run into each other. But then, of course, the flying creatures, they fly over, right? So you play out your early turns of just playing some stuff on the ground, or, you know, you're lucky you're the one going Spyglass Siren into 2-drop into Waterwind Scout. And while nobody can really get in on the ground profitably, these flyers kind of just peck in. You put in equipment on them to increase your clock. And that's another dynamic too, where the ground creatures, you can break that stall if you've got an equipment or two. If you've just got a +1/+1 lying around, keep sending in your biggest thing each turn, they're going to have to make some awkward blocks. That's a way that you can break that board stall kind of feeling. But the flyers just kind of do it with no questions asked. You don't need an equipment. You don't need whatever to get through. They just attack. So anything that has flying in this set that's cheap, I would say is probably a pretty high pick. Just like all the 1-drops, just like, yeah, really pay attention to the way the cheap 1-drop creatures. Pay attention to the cheap flyers too. And funny enough, a lot of these cheap flyers are 1-drops. So just yeah, that shows you why they're performing so well. The next quick hit is kind of like I alluded to a second ago. The equipment in this set actually is good for once. So usually the story is, yeah, you don't want to play these equipment. Equipment are bad. But the equipment in this set, they've definitely pushed them, both by making them cheap to cast and cheap to equip. They also just are very modal, very modular. A lot of things you can do with them. Stuff like Deconstruction Hammer, which is the single white mana, +1/+1, equip 1 equipment that you can pay 3 to sack the hammer, destroy an artifact or enchantment. Sunfire Torch, single red mana for an equipment, equip 1. The equipped creature gets +1/+0, and whenever you attack, you can sack the torch to deal 2 to anything. I even like Pirate Hat, which is 1 and a blue for an equipment, 2 to equip, or 1 to equip to a pirate. The equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has, when this attacks, you get to loot. So all 3 of these I've been pretty happy with. The red and white ones definitely more than the blue one. But not only are these just good cards, like they are, like I mentioned, they are a little bit more pushed than the equipment tend to be. They also play into the game plan of the aggro decks, because the way that the aggro decks tend to play out, like I mentioned a second ago, is you play some cheap things, maybe some evasive things, and once you can't get in anymore, you start suiting things up. So you might have 2 hammers lying around. You have a 2/2 on the battlefield. Your opponent's biggest thing is a 3/3. Okay, well now your 2/2 can attack into that, and they have to make some awkward blocks. You put it on an evasive creature, kind of increase your clock. I often talk about how when you're drafting an aggro deck, you want to ask, how is my aggro deck actually pushing damage? Because, you know, just playing a bunch of creatures won't get the job done. You need combat tricks or removal or just some form of pushing, getting those creatures through. And I do think a very reliable way to do so is these common equipment. So keep your eyes up for these ones. There's some other ones in the set, like the green scythe, and you know, there's a few like black equipment, which I don't think are very good at all. Really, the Jeskai ones, which makes sense too, because of course you get the added bonus of these are equipment, these are artifacts, and you have cards in these colors that care about artifacts. My last quick hit here is talking about the Discover lands. So this is the cycle at common, the caves that each of you tapped. They add the mana of whatever color they tap for. There's 1 for each color. You can pay 5 to tap sack and discover 4. Activate only as a sorceress. I've had a lot of questions about where should you draft these and how many copies do you want to play. I don't think you should draft these particularly highly. I think that I'm happy to pick them up if they come to me around pick 7, pick 8. I do want these cards. They're not just like, I could take them or leave them. I do think in my non-hyper aggro decks with tons of 1-drops, I'm happy with 2. When you get to the aggro decks with a lot of 1-drops, there's a lot of debate there. I know some people who are like, yeah, you should play the first copy. I know some people who are like, I'm never touching a tap land in my deck with 7 1-drops or ways to spend 1 mana, like, a bunch of like a cheap equip costs or something like that. And I fall somewhere in the middle. I've been happy with one of them. I think even in my really low curve aggro decks, I think it will help you a little bit more than it hurts you. Like the benefit of cracking this late game will help you, will be a benefit enough of the time over the times where the tap land might hurt you. Because of course the idea is, well, you want to play tap lands on turn 1, but if you have a lot of 1-drops, you don't have that window to freely play the tap land. The other thing I play here, of course, is Discover gets worse in a deck full of 1-drops. Because if you're discovering 4, well, you're still going to hit a 1-drop a lot of the time. So I would lean towards playing the first one still. This is just my take, by the way. You can feel different about it. I don't feel super strong about this take. You should play 1 in most of your aggro decks, even if they do have some 1s. In the ones that are like super, super low to the ground, you got 7 or 8 or 9, I think then I would probably not want to play one of these lands. But if you're like, 4 1-drops, a bunch of 2s, I think the first copy is totally fine. All right, so that's kind of my overview, the big picture of the set. Let's get a little bit deeper, going to the colors. So like I mentioned, my color rankings have changed a little bit from last week. Not a ton though. I currently have the colors ranked as blue as the best, then white not too far behind, then red not too far behind white, and then green's like really not that far behind red for me anymore. I do think that green has impressed me. There's quite a few commons that have impressed me that go a little bit late. And then black's just the, the redheaded stepchild of all the colors. It's the color that I'm trying not to get into unless I'm pushed into it. Again, it's not undraftable, but I don't think you should draft it just because of the common. So let's just get into each color, talk about what I like about each one. The best blue common, I think for sure, is Waterwind Scout. We're just going to go in the order of best to worst colors. Waterwind Scout is the 3-mana 2/2 flyer that comes in and makes a MAC token. Fantastic card. I have this as the top common. Just gives you a lot for the mana you're paying. I mentioned flyers are pretty good. The map token's obviously great. Past that, you've got a smattering of blue cards that I like roughly equally. You can kind of take based on what you need in the draft. If you need some removal, you might take one over the other. If you need some cheap cards, you might take one over the other. But these cards are Unlucky Drop, which is the 4-mana instant that puts a artifact or creature on the top or bottom of the owner's library. Cogwork Wrestler, single blue mana for the 1/2 flash, gives something -2 until end of turn. Inverted Iceberg, 1 in a blue for a artifact that comes in and mills a card and draws a card, and you can craft for 4 blue to turn into a 6/6 that when it attacks you can tap or untap target creature. Waylaying Pirates, this is the 4-mana 3/3 that comes in and puts a stun counter on something if you control an artifact. And Oaken Siren, 1 in a blue for a 1/2 Flying Vigilance, taps to add blue mana, spend that only to cast artifact spells or activate abilities of artifacts. And it's also an artifact itself. So blue's got a roster of really good commons. These are just like the standout ones. There's a bunch that are just a tier below this too. And like I mentioned, any of these I think you can put in pretty much any deck. The Inverted Iceberg, that's one that goes more for your slower decks, right? For your blue-white craft decks rather than your like blue-red aggro decks. But I think even in your blue-red aggro decks, I'm not too sad to play this card. The thing about blue that's a little bit different compared to most sets is blue is quite aggressive. Blue is playing the tempo plan, playing that flyer plan. You just want to play a 1-drop flyer if you can into, like, the perfect curve is play 1-drop flyer into, like, Oaken Siren, into Waterwind Scout, and then you're just way ahead. Keep your opponent off balance with Cogwork Wrestlers and Unlucky Drops. Certainly, you can still play the control game, too. I think these cards lend themselves to a later game if you'd like to play a later game, too. Oaken Siren, of course, being a card that's good in the aggressive versions of the decks or the controlling versions, adding mana or being an evasive creature. But that's one of the real strengths, I think, of blue, is that all of its good cards play anyway. They play a control game well. They play an aggro game well. You're not really going to get trapped in, like I've got the wrong cards in my wrong deck here. And yes, there might be some cards, like I mentioned, the Iceberg is a little bit better in the controlling decks, and maybe Cogwork Wrestler, where you're getting into combat often, is a little bit better in the aggressive decks. But you're not going to be too wrong, no matter what you do with these blue cards. Moving on to white, and white's an interesting color because like it is in many sets, it's got kind of this split between slower cards and more aggressive cards. And in a lot of sets, that's a problem because you're kind of just diluting either strategy, no matter which one you're trying to draft. It's just like, okay, I'm drafting a controlling white deck. Well, I'm seeing the aggro cards and vice versa, right? You might not see the cards that you want. But I think that enough of white's cards play just like blue in pretty well in both kind of decks that it doesn't end up being that big of a problem. You do need to have in mind which cards are only good in the controlling decks and are only good in the aggressive decks. You don't want to mess that up. But there are still a good number of cards that can play well in both. So my top 2 white commons here are Miner's Guidewing and Old Tech Cloud Guard. Guidewing is the single white 1/1 flyer vigilance, and when it dies, target creature you control explores. Cloud Guard is the 4-mana 3/2 flyer that comes with a 1/1. I've been talking up these cheap flyers. Guidewing is one of those, and its abilities are pretty good. Vigilance plays nicely with equipment or any way to augment your creature. Cloud Guard, classic formula of good creature that comes with a 1/1 friend. We've seen this time and time again recently where these cards are just great, so should not be a surprise to anybody this card is good. Past that, we've got stuff like Petrify, the 2-mana removal spell, which is actually good in this set. Sometimes these aura pacifism variants aren't very good. Petrify just shuts down enough stuff that makes it not a problem. And some of the things that might usually punish Petrify are kind of diminished or kind of don't exist as much in this set. Like the sacrifice stuff, not many people are playing sacrifice decks, so you don't really get punished there. There's also, I've heard some people be like, oh, it's a downside for craft because you put it on their artifact and they can sack that artifact and craft it away. Well, they can craft from their graveyard, so would you complain about 1 and a white destroy target creature or destroy target artifact? Probably not, right? It's not much of a difference. It doesn't actually matter that it stayed on the battlefield because they can craft from the grave anyways. So this is just a good removal spell. I've been very happy to have it. Then we have Tinker's Tote, which I do think is a little bit more of the control-y craft card side than the aggressive side, just because paying 3 mana for 2 1/1s is not very good in your aggro deck. It's definitely a passable card if you have enough cards that want you to tap artifacts or creatures for a benefit, or maybe you're going wide. You've got cards that that do pay you off for going wide, like the uncommon, the 5-mana 4/3 that gives your team +2/+1 when it enters. That makes it a passable card. But I do want to note that Tinker's Tote's been getting a lot of hype early in the set, and I think it's a good card, but not in the kind of decks where you're just like a bunch of 1-drop flyers trying to suit those up and go to town in the air. I think that Tinker's Tote's much more for the slower decks. On the flip side of that, we got Deconstruction Hammer. Single white mana for a equipment. Equip 1. Creature gets +1/+1 and tap to destroy target artifact or enchantment and sack the hammer. This card is the opposite, where you don't really want this in your controlling deck. You want it in the more cheap flyer deck. And you have Iron Paw Aspirant. It's just a solid 2-drop. 2 mana for a 1/2. Comes in, puts a +1/+1 counter on something. So just like blue, like I said, most of these cards play pretty well both ways in your slower decks and your faster decks. I do want to note, though, I want to kind of dig a little bit deeper into the cards that don't play that well in the slower decks or the faster decks. So I had somebody in my Discord the other day come with a white deck, very heavy white, and had a lot of really good cards in it. I have got it on screen here, but for those just listening along, I'll try to illustrate what's happening here. They've got 2 copies of Clayfire Bricks, which is the 2 mana, go get a land, gain 2 life, 7 mana, craft into a +1/+1 to your team, and make 2 1/1s. That's a great card. They've got Master's Guide Mural. This was a blue-white deck, which is the Signpost Uncommon. Artifact comes in, makes a 4/4 craft for 7 mana to create like a 4/4 factory. You've got stuff like Ultic Archaeologist, which is the 5 mana 4/4 in white at common that either rebuys an artifact from the grave or you can scry 3, and that's a fine card in your slower white decks, but you don't really want it in your aggressive white decks. And then you got stuff on the other side of the spectrum like Miner's Guidewing and Rune Lurker Bat, another 1/1 flyer, which are going to be fine, but not as good in a deck where you're really dedicated to suiting them up, right? Really wanting to like go to town, make those big early. That's the way you're playing the game. So what I did when I took this person's deck, because I thought it was a bit confused, is what it came down to. I separated into 3 columns. Column A is good in the aggro versions of the white decks. Column B is pretty much good anywhere. Column C was only good in the controlling versions of the white decks. And I think there's some bleed here and there. You know, I was mentioning Miner's Guidewing and Rune Lurker Bat. I think those are still fine in slower decks, but just not optimized. So while I don't think it happens that often where your white deck ends up confused, if you're not thinking about this at all and you're just drafting like, oh, like, you know, drafting from a tier list or looking at 17lands.com, like what are the most winning cards in white, and you're just taking those cards, you can end up in a spot where it's like, all right, you got all these cheap flyers and then these things that once you get to 7 mana, and there's a bit of a disconnect there, right? Of course, Rune Lurker Bat, being a lifelinker, not as much of a disconnect, but at a certain point, if all of your things that you're playing in the early game are just these cheap things that attack well but don't block well, you're going to have a bit of a problem if you're then trying to get the 7 mana. So there's certainly room for some of these cards, but you don't want to load your deck with them. Like, this deck, for example, has 6 1-drop flyers. I think that's a little bit dissonant with cards that want you to get to 7 mana, is kind of the thought here. So don't feel like you're making a giant mistake if you're putting one of these kind of cards in one deck and one in the other, because I do think, again, Clayfire Bricks is fine in your aggro decks. The Master's Guide Mural is okay. You could play it. It's just not going to be optimal. That's all. Moving on to red. Red's also got a pretty deep roster of commons. So we've got a Braid. We've got a Tali's Favor, which, by the way, if you have not caught kind of the companion piece to this State of the Format episode, I released the other day a short video also on the podcast feed that's just talking about some of the commons that have been performing very well and don't look very good. I was just explaining kind of why they're doing well, why you'd want the cards. And Atali's Favor, which is the 2 and a red enchantment that enters the battlefield, discovers 3, and the enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and trample. Really strong card. I think that this is in the same power tier as a Braid. If you haven't listened to that episode, basically you can think of this as a souped up Red Tooth Genealogist from the last set from Wilds of Eldraine, where you put it on your 2-drop creature now can attack. You also then get, if you're very lucky, a 3-drop. If you're not that lucky, you get a 2-drop. That's probably also fine. Sometimes you hit a 1, but even that's not that bad, right? This is quite a powerful card. You can also chain them into each other, going favor into favor into favor if you have a lot of them. I wouldn't be sad to play multiples of this. In fact, they do play well together. I think this is just a good combo. You should just treat this as a great card when you see it in a pack. Like, don't be like, I might pick that up later. This is just a good card. Goblin Tomb Raider, the best red creature at common, I believe. Single red mana for a 1/2 that gets haste and +1 if you control an artifact. Just extremely efficient, really hard to beat. Volatile Wanderglyph. This is one that I think is a little bit underrated, just based on where I see it in packs. 1 red for a 2/2 artifact. When it becomes tapped, you can discard a card and you can draw a card. It doesn't look that exciting, but it just checks a lot of boxes. Just is an artifact, is a 2-drop, gives you some filtering, plays well with the things that let you tap things for effects. So don't overlook this one. This one I think a lot of people kind of are overlooking. Then a few other things here. Plundering Pirate is the 3-mana pirate that makes a treasure when it comes in. Sunfire Torch, the equipment that you can shock something when you attack. And Sunshot Militia, this is the 1 red 1/3 that you can tap 2 artifacts or creatures you control to deal 1, activate only as a sorcery. This is a card that shocked a lot of people, I think, in the first few days, myself included, that it wasn't just a terrible card. It actually does pretty good stuff because there's a lot of stuff just lying around the battlefield, equipment and treasure tokens, and just little trinkets. So this does do pretty good work. I do think it's become overrated at this point now. Like, I've seen people put this in their, like, red-green dino deck, and it's like, okay, this isn't going to be very good there. You're not really that kind of deck. You do want to be able to flood the board with cheap artifacts. If you're doing that, I like a copy or two, but don't go overboard. Don't buy too much into the hype on this card. It's a solid one, definitely better than a lot of people anticipated, but it's not like a top red common or anything. Let's move on to green now, and I'm very excited to talk about green. So I think for most of this podcast that if you've been playing the format, you've kind of been in tune, there probably isn't that much that's going to shock you with what I've said today. Most of it's like, yeah, nod your head along, that makes sense. But a recent development that I found in this format and kind of a pull into other decks that aren't just the Jeskai decks is a specific green common, and it might not be the common you're thinking of unless you're watching and you see it's much bigger than the rest. This is Staggering Size. This is this combat trick. 1 and a green for an instant. Target creature gets +3/+3 and gains trample until end of turn. I feel no hesitation in saying that this card's great. This is a really, really strong combat trick. It solves the problem of that combat tricks generally have, or any combat trick that has trample will solve this problem, where usually the downside of a combat trick is they still get to block, they gain a little bit of life virtually, even though you cast your trick, win the combat, they're still at a higher life total. Trample means that's not true. Your 4/4 gets double blocked by their 2/2s, you Staggering Size, you kill them both, you deal them 3. That's really quite strong. And of course, sometimes you get in situations where your opponent like chump blocks with a 1/1, you can Staggering Size for lethal. So this is a card that you should be really looking at as the linchpin for green aggro. I talked up green aggro a little bit at the start and said I'd get into it as we went on. This is me getting into it. I'll play 3, even 4 copies of this card. And the great thing is that it's currently going quite late. Like, this is a card you get close to last pick. It's not on a lot of people's radars. So this is like the hidden tech. I haven't done too many like, ooh, yeah, people aren't doing this and here's your secret to winning. This is the hidden tech. I do believe that this is going completely under people's radars. And if you are in a position where you're drafting basically any green deck, because I don't think the green decks in this format are very, like, big, rampy controller. They're definitely more aggressive. if you're drafting almost any green deck in this format, you're going to want as many copies of this card as you can. Now, I of course want to caveat with, you need to be attacking. You need to have a plan of, I've got some reasonably large creatures. And green does provide that. Just going through a few of them here. Pathfinding Axe Draw. This is the 4-mana 4/3 that explores when it enters the battlefield. Just really massive. 4-mana 4/5/4 is just huge at that point in the curve. Really dwarfs the rest of the board. Cavern Stomper. This is the 6-mana 7/7 that when it enters the battlefield, you scry 2, and you can pay 4 mana, and then it can't be blocked by creatures power 2 or less this turn. And then Armored Kincaller is the 3-mana 3/3 that when it enters the battlefield, if you control a dino or you can reveal one from your hand, you gain 3 life. Just a pretty solid creature to bridge the gap between surviving against aggro and then just being a beefy creature you can attack with. So all of these play really well with Staggering Size. If you're red-green, red-green dinos, this is the card you want. Just to put some weight behind what I'm saying here with Staggering Size, if you filter on 17 lands by top players, so you're just looking at the how the cards are performing for the best players out there, Staggering Size is one of the top 5 performing commons in the whole set. Like, really a testament to how strong this card is. And it's just a pretty simple plan, right? It's not that complicated. Play big things, then start attacking, which is Staggering Sizes. Some other green commons, Poison Dart Frog, the ramp creature. I like that. Wally's Final Strike, the bite spell, perfectly solid. But this is the core of my green decks, just Staggering Size. Keep it in mind. Keep your eye on it. Don't pass them if you see them late if you're in green. And then just quickly here, black. So black's got a smattering of commons that I am interested in, but nothing that I'm really excited about. So we've got Join the Dead, which is the 1 black, -5/-5. It's going to be a solid removal spell. You do have to be heavy black, I think, to really appreciate this card, because black is tough at a lot of points in the curve. If you do end up in a spot where your opponent plays a 3-drop bomb and you have not black and this card's in your hand, you're like, okay, yeah, like the black really rearing its ugly head here. I do think it's important to be able to cast this card on turn 3. You might think, okay, this removal spell can kill anything. I want to save it for late game, the bigger things. The things you have to answer in this format are the ones in the 2s and the 3s, for the most part. And so if that's not on by the early parts of the game, by turn 3, Join the Dead's not going to be that effective. So I think it's a card that I'm much less excited about than I think most people. Tithing Blade, 1 in a black artifact. Your opponent sacks something when it comes in. 5 mana to craft, turns into the artifact. That drains your opponent for 1 each turn. This card's pretty solid. I don't think it's like fantastic by any means. It's not like, oh man, I got all the Tithing Blades in the world. My deck's awesome. But it's certainly a fine card for your black decks. Black's really good at slowing down the game. That is the one thing I think it really excels at. It's good at putting these Death Touch blockers out and making the ground kind of gummed up. Tithing Blade, the backside of it means that you can drain your opponent out on a stalled board. And that actually kind of touches on what Black's general problem is that it's good at slowing down the game, but isn't very good at closing it out. And this is why I do think you need rares to be able to do that, because if you're just slowing down the game and you don't have top end power, why are you slowing down the game is kind of the idea. The Descend payoffs that I think are meant to be common ways to close the game aren't that good. Like, they're just not reliable finishers. So you walk into this problem where you're like, okay, I've got these Dead Weights and Join the Dead and Tithing Blades and Deathcap Marionette, which is another card I like, the 2-mana 1/1 Death Touch that comes in and mills too. And then it's like, okay, the game slowed down, but my opponent just eventually can chew through my defenses. So what am I doing here? I do really think you want to start with bombs to get into black. And if you do start with bombs, something that's very important is another chance. 2 in a black for an instant. Mill 2, and then you return 2 creatures from your grave to your hand. And this is kind of the thing that fuels has your black decks going. Not only does it help you find your bombs, but helps you recur them. So black just tends to fall into this control-centric game plan where you're controlling the game early, then you're trying to recur bombs, cast some removal spells. The main issue, or one of the main issues with black too, is that it's very not aggressive. So whereas I think most colors can play reasonably well both ways, white and blue being chief among them, red is more aggressive, and I think green is more aggressive, but black can only play a slow game. It's really not equipped to play a fast game, so pairing your black cards with your like blue cards, your blue aggro cards, doesn't really work out that often. You have to have kind of specific slower cards that aren't necessarily going to be the kind of cards you want to draft early in those other colors anyway, so it has problems pairing with the other colors. So that's kind of my overview of black. And these cards I'm pointing out here, Deadweight, Join the Dead, Tithing Blade, all serviceable, right? I just want to point out you shouldn't be like, ooh, 6-pick Deadweight and move in to black because of that. That's not the reason you want to get into black. All right, just to close out here, a few more things. I'm going to touch on a few archetypes, just some thoughts here and there. We're going to start with the Jeskai decks. I imagine this is not going to be anything revolutionary for people that have been playing, but if you're newer to the format, I do just want to point out that blue-red, I still have as the best deck, blue-red artifact aggro. And it's pretty straightforward if you've never drafted this deck before. Like, it's just like, take the good blue cards, take the good red cards. That'll generally point you in the direction that this deck wants to go naturally. Like the cards that I pointed out, the Waterwind Scouts, the Goblin Tomb Raiders, the cheap equipment, the good pirate, cheap pirates. Like, it's really not that hard to get into a red-blue pirate deck by just taking the good cards, and it's a good place to be. So as long as you can, like, I've been getting into really good red-blue decks this week and last week. I do think, like I mentioned, this is going to be the turning point in the format. Now the quick draft is up, and I don't think I'm going to get awesome red-blue decks anymore. But sometimes, you know, it's going to be there still. Sometimes you're going to have those seats. Blue-white is an archetype I want to talk about, or a color pair, I should say, because out of all of the color pairs, I think it is the one that splits what it wants to do more often than not, being sometimes you're like super tempo-y flying deck, sometimes you're more of a slow crafting control deck. Like I mentioned before, you do want to really make that distinction. And the reason you end up being split so often is kind of a an embarrassment of riches in a way, because the white cards and the blue cards do play well both ways, where the other colors in the set don't really play well both ways. And so you can end up in this spot where you're like, yeah, I'm just taking good blue and white cards, but you do have some clashing here and there. So a sign of the more aggro decks, or the cards you want in the more aggro versions, are, like I mentioned, the many cheap flyers you can, the cheap equipment, cheap, tempo interaction spells. And then in the control versions, you want different cards. You're going to want stuff like the exile spell, the Whirlpool, which is 3 mana, exile target tap creature, or you can pay 6 to exile any creature. That's a card I'm more interested in my controlling decks than in my beatdown decks. Although, if your beatdown decks are almost all flying creatures, then that card's fine too, because as long as you're not attacking on the ground, where, that card's not very good if you're trying to get through blockers, but if you're just flying over them and they're attacking you back with their big dinos or whatever, sure, that card plays pretty well. Anything that's like, kill a tapped creature, or exile target tapped creature, that's going to be better in the controlling version of the deck. So, like I mentioned, it's not that hard to put together a deck in blue and white where all of your cards are at least reasonably coherent together. Might not be perfect, but they're strong enough that the power level can kind of override the fact that some of your cards might not be perfect in your deck. I'm going to be playing my Saw Blades, my Deal 5s, and my Clay Fried Bricks almost all the time. But if you have the option to optimize and lean one way or the other, it's good to keep that in mind. And then those green aggro decks I was talking about. So, not going to go too deep, but I did want to call out green-white as probably one of the least drafted archetypes right now, and one of the better archetypes in my mind. So green-white's not very complicated. You do have the signpost in common, Kutsil, which is 1 green-white for a 3/3. Your opponents can't cast spells during your turn, and whenever one of your creatures deals combat damage, if its power was greater than its base power, then you draw a card. You only draw 1 per turn, though. You can't have like 3 of them attacking. It's gated for 1. And so just reads pretty strong, is pretty strong. It is a pull into green-white, but green-white doesn't need anything special, really. Just think of it as an aggro deck where you've got the cheap white flyers that are pecking in, you've got some equipment, paired to those big green dinos that I was saying do a pretty good job of invalidating the rest of the small boards. And then staggering size, of course, ties it all together, where you're just like, all right, well, I'm pecking in early, and then if you deal with my early threats, my early flyers, then these big green dinos can trample through. Not too fancy, nothing too special, but definitely something that I think is not quite obvious, because the green-white's not this theme that brings people in. It's not like, oh man, like I'm drafting green-white, I know what I'm doing. So you tend to get Kutsil a little bit later than you might for some of the other gold cards. And also its theme is not, it's not, once you start drafting green-white, it's not like, oh, I know exactly what to take. I'm telling you, I think what you should take is just like the cards that go in the green and white aggro decks, and you're going to have a pretty good deck. I think you can be a bit more mid-rangey. Like I've had decks where I have some good green top end, maybe some of the green craft cards. Certainly can go into that space a little bit more if you end up heavier green rather than white. But I would think of this green-white as an aggro deck first and foremost. The last archetype I want to talk about is black-white, and not black-white sacrifice, because like I mentioned, I really don't think that this works. Like there's just too much disconnect between what you want to be doing in this deck, sacrificing all these like trinket things, and the incentives of the format, which are either go way over the top or go way under. It's just a bit too in the middle. So what I do think you want to do with black-white, I found success, and black-white's actually been one of my more successful decks, is just draft it as a control deck. You can sort of think of it like blue-white craft, except blue is being replaced by the slow black cards, and it's got a very similar plan. You want to have the removal that picks off the tapped creatures. You're not playing to be aggressive. And the way you're closing out the game is generally with craft cards. And black offers you a craft card here and there. You got the Visage, which turns into the big menace creature. So you've got the white craft cards that you naturally would in blue-white, plus a craft card or two in black that can help you get over that hump. You also get a little bit, more interaction than you would from blue. And also, you get to use some of these slower white cards like you would in blue-white. A card I want to call out, actually, that I haven't got a chance to is the Sunwing, the flyer, the land cycler, the 6-mana, 3/5, gain 3 when it enters and has flying, and has plane cycling. That card's actually been pretty strong for me in my slower white decks. I'm not saying it's a high pick by any means, but once again, it's another card that you get kind of late that I think you can value. Like, I've been pretty happy just as those is my closing out my game and stabilizing me in my black-white control decks, just bunch of removal, tithing blade, stuff like that, slowing down the game, closing it out somehow. It doesn't have to be the most efficient or fast finisher. I think the Sunwing just gets the job done if you don't have anything else better. So just wanted to point this black-white deck out because, again, I think just like green-white, it's something that's not obvious, something that's not on a lot of people's radars, and something that I've had a lot of success with. And then for our last segment here, I just wanted to talk about some of the better uncommons in this set because I think there are some really, really strong uncommons, and they're going later than they should. So first of all, I'm on 17lands.com, by the way, just sorting by game in hand win rate for the best uncommons here. Zoetic Glyph. So if you haven't had the pleasure of playing with this or the displeasure of playing against it, this card is fantastic. It is currently winning at 64.5 game in hand win rate, which that makes it land in the top 10 cards in the entire set. So the reason this card is so good is it's a 3-mana 5/4 haste. like that is the baseline, right? Yes, it's an aura. It's not exactly that, but there's so many artifacts running around. Sometimes it's actually an advantage that this is an aura because if this was just a creature, a 3-mana creature, then it would just be a 3-mana 5/4 and wouldn't get that hasty ability. You also couldn't put it on a flyer, for example, like an Oaken Siren, and have this be evasive. I should read this out, by the way. So this is 3 mana for a aura, and enchants a artifact. The artifact becomes a 5/4 in addition to its other types, a 5/4 creature, and this is the key part. When it's put into the battlefield from the graveyard, when Zoetic Glyph, this card, this aura, you discover 3. So not only is this a 3-mana 4/5 hasty creature, but it's a 5/4 hasty creature that your opponent can never interact with profitably. They can petrify it, I suppose, right? Put the passivism on it. But everything else, barring you bouncing their creature or killing their creature in response to this Zoetic Glyph, you're not going to be able to trade profitably. So you've got this rock in a hard place, right? Massive creature that you need to kill or else you die. And, well, if you kill it, they get value. Really phenomenal card. I know it doesn't look like your typical busted card in Limited, but it really is a busted card. Like, I truly believe this card probably shouldn't have gone to print as is if they were balancing strictly for the Limited format, right? This reads to me like a card that was pushed for Constructed a little bit more than they were thinking about how busted it would be in Limited. This is the blue 1/1 flyer that makes a map token. Deep Cavern Bat is one that I want to call out here. 1 in a black for a 1/1 flying lifelink. When it enters the battlefield, look at your opponent's hand. You can take a card from it and exile it until the bat leaves the battlefield. Phenomenal card. Just really good in the world of cheap bombs that you want to interact with or you want to answer before they come down. Good in the world of aggro, where a cheap lifelink flyer is going to be. Good in the world of equipment, where you can put an equipment on this thing. Really something that I think is actually pretty underrated right now, considering it's going around 3rd pick on average. That means sometimes you get this card like 5th or 6th, and I don't think that should really be happening. Same thing with the Siren and the Glyph, by the way. Those cards are going around 3rd or 4th on average, which is a little bit later than I think they should be going. A lot of the cards on this list I've kind of already talked about. Rune Lurker Bat, it's Quint, which is the red, green, golden common. That card's great. So not a ton of surprises going down the list as we go. But I did want to bring attention to sorting by Elsa, which is average last seen at. And this can actually tell you where people are taking cards on average. And now you do want to point this out as I think there are some pretty overrated cards that people are taking from the uncommon slot. So number 1, Chupacabra Echo is the number 1 taken uncommon. And I think it's actually fine to take this. Like I was saying, you don't want to get into black without rares. This is close-ish to a rare, where especially if your game plan is recur this a bunch of times, this is, by the way, the Chupacabra Echo is the 4-mana 3/2 that when it enters the battlefield, the target creature an opponent controls gets -X, where X is the number of permanent cards in your graveyard. This card, I think, is good enough to first pick if you really wanted to get into black, but the fact that it's getting taken as the top uncommon in the set does say to me that people are getting into black a little too readily. Same story with the next uncommon that's taken pretty highly, Bitter Triumph. That's the black removal spell, 1 black, destroy target creature, a planeswalker, and you have to discard a card or pay 3 life. And then one more that I wanted to call out that I actually thought was going to be pretty good, but ended up not being all that impressive is the Scytheclaw Raptor. This is a 3 mana, 2 and a red, 4/3. Then whenever a player casts a spell, if it's not their turn, the Raptor deals 4 damage to them. And that actually has been really painful for the person with the card. Because this is symmetrical, right? It's not just like, well, I'm putting this in my deck, it's only hurting you. No. Like, you also get punished for casting the instance, which is a pretty big deal. So I just wanted to point out both sides of the coin here. Cards that people are definitely underrating, like the Glyph and some of the cheap flyers. And then some of these ones that people I think are overrating by a little bit, the good black cards and some not so great cards. And this is just a good thing to do, by the way. Like, I'm pointing out a few here. I could have a whole podcast episode going down this list saying things that I think are being taken a little bit too early, things that are taken a little bit too late. Check out this list if you'd like yourself. Of course, this is always available on 17lands.com. And then final thought here, I had some people asking for some thoughts on draft navigation, how I'm actually navigating the drafts, my game plan going in before I open my first pack. And it kind of mirrors the tiers of decks I was talking about. Like, my plan A is try to get into the Jeskai decks if I can. Try to get into blue-white or red-white, like one of these just the good decks in the format that have good support at common. If those aren't open, I'll try to move to one of the green aggro decks. And usually if Jeskai is closed off, green tends to be open. And then if both of those lanes are closed, I'll move into black, right? The wrench in this plan is what happens if you open a black bomb, like an Aclazotz, which is one of the best cards in the set. I will take that black bomb most of the time. I won't take it over some of the better Jeskai uncommons. Like, if I see a Clayfry Bricks or a Siren or a Staunch Crewmate, which is the 2 mana, 2/1 in blue that looks at the top 4 cards of your library, you can take an Artifact or a Pirate, one of these kind of cards. I will probably take those over a black bomb that's not Aclazotz, the 5 mana 4/4 flying lifelink. Like, I will take that card over basically anything. But some of the lesser bombs, I probably would take a Jeskai uncommon. That being said, I don't think there's anything wrong with starting with the black bombs. As long as you know how to draft black. I think drafting black is the most challenging thing to do because the balances of the kind of effects you want, like how much early interaction versus cheap creatures versus how much top end do you need, that's something that I think is a little bit tough to get right without a little bit of know-how. But I wouldn't recommend not doing it, for example. I wouldn't be like, no, just don't touch that. One final thought I have about draft navigation in this format is I do think you want to be reading the signals and drafting what the open colors are as much as you can. Like, there are some formats where it's like, no, these are the best decks, you should just try to draft them. Well, that's true, you should try to. I don't think it's at all costs. And because there are so many good rares and uncommons in this set, I really want to set myself up for a good pack 3. Because pack 3 will have the most powerful cards that you're going to see in all of the draft, basically. Because pack 1, people are just taking the best cards. You're not going to see very many good cards. But by the time you get to pack 3, people are locked into their lane, right? And if you can get into the right colors and get past a Breaches pick 3 or, some great card in your colors, that's going to be really, really beneficial if you can preemptively put yourself in those colors. So try to read the signals, try to see what's open, and I do think you get pretty rewarded in pack 3 in this format. And that is it. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Next week, well, I'm not exactly sure what we're going to do next week. We might do the gameplay level up episode for this format. We might have a few other thoughts that maybe as the meta does shift this week, I'll have some completely different thoughts on the format that I'll bring to the table. But if not, we'll get into some gameplay, get into some other things. In any case, thank you so much for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.